But I think there's also like a scaredness of posting things on the internet now. You're going to hate him as a person. And if that's where our politics is going, that necessarily isn't conducive to nice democratic debate. So it isn't just a sense of who can create the best memes or the most effective memes. It's about who also can use what channels they have in the most effective way.
Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Jay Thakkar Show. It's been a bit of a time, and today we have Dr. Liam McLoughlin.
Yes.
I hope I pronounced it right.
Definitely have.
So he is a professor in the communication department in the University of Liverpool. He has expertise in understanding how memes, social media sort of works in democracy, elections, and politics. And we're going to understand that. So thank you so much, Liam, thank you so much for giving your time. So, like, how do we first sort of understand the engagement of citizens in politics or elections or democracy through social media?
It's a really interesting question, and there is so much to get into. It's a really expansive question, actually. And there's a wide set of different pieces of research and research topics and areas which try to understand this question. One of these is called the normalization versus equalization argument, and this is one which seeks to understand if social media gives grassroots, it gives third parties, it gives average everyday citizens more power in the political system, and that would be called equalization, or if it's what's called a normalizing force, and that is more of the same. You have platforms being used by parties to enhance their pre-existing power and influence, especially through communications. And it's a question that's never really fully been answered, because every single time a new technology comes around, a new social media platform comes through, memes get developed, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, which I'm looking forward to. This question, this debate sparks and reignites. Optimists like me like to think that social media can be this really powerful force for everyday citizens to get their voice heard in ways which they haven't had before, to curtail the media, to circumvent it in some ways and have their influence that way. But more pessimistic people tend to argue that, again, the same people who were powerful before the elites, political parties, with main political parties, they will continue to win the argument on social media. So that's where that kind of debate tends to sit, and where a lot of my research lies as well.
Interesting. But then with social media, like, first when we used to consume information, we used to read long articles in newspaper, or we used to watch an hour-long debate on news channels, on televisions. But now even the length of consumption of information is either through a meme or through an Instagram reel or a TikTok video, and that's 60 seconds or 90 seconds. That's very short. So verification of information, understanding what information is correct or not, even that sort of comes in a vague picture. Then how do we like how does then those memes sort of shape political understanding without actually going in depth and sort of convincing, for lack of a better word?
That's a really good question. I think I want to go back to the start of where you kind of assume there's this big assumption, actually, that in the golden era, we always have this golden era of thinking across the world and different things, from steam trains to transport and all sorts. This idea that back in the day, people watched them hour-long debates, that they read newspapers thoroughly. And if you look back, it's actually not necessarily the case. You've always had low engagement, low information citizens. So when people start being like, I'm really, really concerned about this new form of social media, I like to go back to past life. Actually, were those types of people who only consume short-form content did they used to read the news anyway, right? And it's a really interesting question because if you look at it from that perspective, it allows you to be a bit more optimistic. It allows you to be like, actually, maybe these short-form videos and short-form content and things, simple things such as memes, are not necessarily replacing something that was already pre-existing, already there, right? So that's the first thing just to consider with this question, is people haven't always been politically engaged. There is argument to say that political engagement has decreased over time. If you look at voting patterns and voting trends, voter turnout has decreased over time. So there is the argument that people have become less interested in long-form content, but that's always quite hard to establish. When it comes to memes, I think the power of memes and kind of short-form content, it's a bit of a double-edged sword in the sense that it allows people to very quickly reframe issues in zeitgeist, right? So thinking back to like Theresa May in 2017, when she was coming out with statements that seemed somewhat robotic, and then people were like, I'm going to reframe that as a meme very quickly as a form of political satire. Memes do allow people just to quickly reframe these issues and post them forward, and these issues can hopefully spread further than they had previously, right? But again, they're not policy documents, they're not white papers. Memes are not things which contain lots of information which is very, very useful, which people should be using to vote upon, right? So if people are voting just because of memes, I think democracy could be in trouble. But if it's an addendum to that, and it helps people start their communication, start that discussion, start that discourse, maybe memes are a pretty good thing. But there is another area we should be really cautious of, is whenever we're dealing with short-form content, humorous content, very emotional content, which is what we see through short-form video, what we see through memes, is that they're firstly loaded with emotion, right? They pre-tell you typically when you look at them the first microsecond, if you're angry, should you be laughing, should you be dismaying someone? And because of that kind of psychological response, you don't often sit there and go, I'm going to verify that's true, right? So the problem with memes and short-form content is it doesn't give people the space to be critical. So if you have a very angry meme and you see it and they see a picture of Boris Johnson, you're going to associate Boris Johnson and be like, I'm angry about Boris Johnson, right? Same way you might see a picture of, or an AI-generated image of Keir Starmer in a burqa, which you saw during the last general election. We know that's not true, but the way it was loaded and framed, it made people angry, rightly or wrongly so. So that's a big issue when it comes to this type of content, doesn't facilitate people being critical about politics, doesn't help with the discussion often, and it's often very angry. That helps.
But then I understand that it doesn't have the space to be critical, but then making people angry or making people feel a certain emotion would also spread a different narrative on selecting a candidate during election. And selecting a candidate during election through lack of information would then be a threat to democracy? Oh
yeah, definitely. I think there's nothing, if you look through all the democratic theorists, what they say about what's called correct voting. Correct voting is this concept that someone would look through the policies of a political party and go through and say, okay, this is the party, if they were to come into power, that would benefit me the most, right? That's the idea of correct voting. If you have people, like as you say, going, oh, here's a meme about, I don't know, a very positive meme about Nigel Farage or Kemi Banadok, right? And you'd be like, oh, I'm going to vote for her even though it's not in their interest to do so. That's problematic, and that starts distrust in the system as well. It's no surprise that in America we're seeing people looking at policies of Donald Trump and being like, oh, I didn't think Donald Trump would do that versus on the memes, right? And that's problematic because people are going to become very angry and they're going to take action. They're going to have distrust in politics. Maybe they won't go on to vote later on because they go, what's the point? They'll say things such as they're all the same because they're not doing things that I wanted them to do because they're not voting the correct way, right? So, yeah, it's really quite damaging for democracy if people are voting like that on that low information basis.
But then also on the contrary, some benefits of it are like engaging youth on a very early stage to sort of look through things.
Yeah.
Because when there's a meme about something, it's not only about just a person. The meme also represents one act or a policy or an intent of the particular person to sort of attach emotion to it. So that also engages youth, or at least exposes youth to sort of one idea for one policy of one particular person they might vote in the future.
Yeah, and it's one of the things we talk about in mine and Ross Southern's journal when we looked at memes in 2017 election is what we call small political acts. And these are, and we view memes as a way for people to express themselves, right? When we saw, for example, during the 2016 US presidential election, and we saw, because of TikTok, because of memes, young people going out and saying they're going to go to a stadium which Donald Trump was going to speak to, and then just not turning up to embarrass him, that's because of memes, right? So they do have this political force, and in the sense that they allow people to, sometimes they're not going to take action, sometimes they're just going to click, that they like to post, or they're going to reshare a post, but it may incite them, it may inform them of an issue, might help them, just push them a little bit over the edge to take action offline. But it's also important in the sense that people can use memes to feel represented, to let their views known. Most citizens, they don't go out there to create their own political campaign, right? They don't sit there creating YouTube channels, talking about their politics, right? That's a very, very rare thing for citizens to do, especially young citizens. They've got better things to be doing anyway. But because memes are very quick and they're a short form video is very easy to produce on the grand scale of things, it's still a skill to create a very effective short form video. It allows them to feel like they have a voice sometimes, right? That's a really important thing in democracy, for people to feel. Again, it's the contrary, that's the other side to a point I previously made. When people do make their statements known, they feel like they have made a change in some ways. That would go on to help them take maybe a bigger political act, and maybe they'll start voting more, or maybe they'll even stand to be an MP or something like that in the future. So that's an important dynamic that we don't know too much about. There is previous work that is quite pessimistic on it. There is a concept called slacktivism, where because social media allows people to take action very quickly, that might replace action which is actually meaningful. So, for example, rather than signing a petition that may, for example, in the United Kingdom, if you get a petition, you get enough signatures, it has to be debated with the House of Commons, something like that. Rather than doing a meaningful act like that, they start spreading memes. That's when we get slacktivism, right? The idea that you do something meaningless rather than something that's meaningful. But at the same time, if memes are making people feel more represented, that they have a voice, it could be a good thing, right? But this is an issue we need to, definitely more research is needed in. Again, memes are a fairly old concept now, but I think it's only last 10 years or so they've been taken as politically serious. So we need to know more about that.
Yeah, sure. And like during the 2017 UK election, like there was a news that memes fueled sort of a youth quake kind of thing. So like according to you, like what extent did social media actually increase the footfall or voter turnout?
Yeah, so the 2017 youth quake, so it's actually a bit of a controversial subject actually. Because after the 2017 general election, Jeremy Corbyn didn't win, the Labour Party didn't win, but they did a lot better than was expected, right? In the sense that the reason why the election was called was the Conservatives thought they were in a better place, that they would be able to shore up their mandate, they'd be able to win a few more MPs in the House of Commons and get votes through a bit easier. But what ended up happening was they still won, but they didn't win like they expected to. And part of the punditry afterwards and the debate about this was, oh, this was because young people started turning out. And that's what most people went with, because that was what the Labour Party was trying to do in this general election. They were using Facebook a lot. They were using lots of grassroots activism, areas where young people tend to be more active in. So the assumption was made that, yes, this social media activism, the memes, even memes, Facebook groups often as well, was the cause of not that win for the Labour Party, but the fact that they did better than they thought they would. But then some studies come out afterwards. There was something called the British Election Study. Big, huge survey, thousands of people who were surveyed there. After they leave the voting booth, they're directly asked, okay, who did you vote for? Why did you vote? What's your demographics? Things like this. And the picture from that is a bit more murky. It says, actually, maybe young people didn't turn out as much as we thought they had. Yes, they had been turning out, but it wasn't necessarily just young people that changed it. So that's made that question about the youthquake a bit more kind of desperate, a bit more different. But what we did see was, after the 2017 general election, the Conservatives took a very keen eye look at what Labour were doing, how this grassroots activism was operating, and tried to copy that in the 2019 one, which is why we have fantastic videos. I hope you can overlay this onto the video of what's called Boris Wave, which was lo-fi versions of Boris Johnson sat on a train with musical tracks. And that was the brainchild of two meme experts from New Zealand who the Conservatives brought over from New Zealand to the UK to make some memes for them, to generate that grassroots activism. But by then, something quite interesting happened. The fact that Facebook was a very different beast from 2017 to 2019. So it became a lot less relevant with that grassroots activism on the basis that Facebook became this pay-to-play win platform. So when we think about questions like this, we have to also think about the platforms as well. And it became more of an advertising battle. It was more about who could spend the most in Facebook adverts. So one of the lessons we've learned through that shift from 2017 to 2019 was not necessarily how do you use memes effectively, how do you generate grassroots activism. It's how you learn the language of platforms, right? It's how you create a campaign which best fits the platform's kind of architecture, its affordances. For example, with Facebook, you have to put lots of money in. And we saw that again in the 2024 general election, with parties using TikTok all of a sudden. And that was really interesting because before the election was called, only two political parties in the United Kingdom had a TikTok account. That was the Green Party and Reform. Because before then, all the political parties were like, no, we're not going to join TikTok. This is a Chinese-owned app. It's a security risk. But suddenly they started realizing, actually, TikTok's quite a big platform. So it's really interesting to see, because all the parties created their TikTok accounts a couple of days after the general election. I think the Conservatives created theirs a few days before the general election was called, because they knew they were going to call it. And they started doing really bland, rubbish posts. This really boring kind of content that was obviously taken from other platforms and put onto TikTok. I think only really Reform knew what they were doing on the platform. But very quickly you start seeing the parties learning how to use TikTok accurately and correctly. I have spoken to some of the people behind the scenes who are actually running all these TikTok accounts. And one of them just went, yes, because I asked them about this date. There was a really particular date. I won't say which political party it was. I asked them, okay, your content changed hugely after this date. And they sat back and just like, yeah, the party leadership and the party campaign just said, what we're telling you to do isn't quite working. Do what you want to do. And this person was like, hurrah, I can do what I want to do on this platform. And they started shit posting. They were posting memes. They were posting GIFs on top of things. They were creating short form videos with music in the background, some with AI voices. The Labour Party, for example, they just started posting AI-generated images of cats at one point, because they learned that's what you should be doing on that particular platform, and to speak the platform language, as they call it, to really boost their message and get it out there. So, yeah, it's a really big question, and I can go on for days, and I wouldn't want to stop all the other questions. But yeah, that's kind of what we've seen as platforms have changed throughout time, and also how parties have used different platforms. You can see it from each general election to the next.
Interesting. And like with youngsters getting involved in elections and the use of social media and memes and stuff, do you think it's now more unpredictable for people in general in terms of how the elections would go or how the votes will turn out to be in comparison to how predicted things would be? But I mean, I understand that it, like, you predict and there's no guarantee that it will turn out to be the correct. But like you said, that some party did better than what was expected.
Yeah.
So even the prediction and expectation, do you think there'll be a huge mismatch?
I think that's a good question, actually. Parties will always stick to their core policies. I think if you're a political party and you're going into a general election without a manifesto, without certain points that you're going to be talking about, you're probably not doing politics very well, right? Political parties should have certain ideologies, should have certain policies that they would want to enact if they were elected. And they're going to stay the same. If you look back through literature, it's Wolfsfeld et al., they talk a bit about this, that the politics and the policies are always which matter the most. But what you're describing has kind of been unpredictability. I think it depends on the platform. Again, if we look at the last general election in 2024 one, parties didn't go into the election thinking they were going to post seal memes and cat memes and things like that. They knew what policies they were going to be talking about, but they didn't know what memes would be zeitgeist, right? So the skill for parties is to look at what the current kind of platform language is, to look at what the zeitgeist is, to look at what the current kind of culture is, and tap into that. And then the art is finding the right types of content and memes that align to their policies. Some of the most kind of popular and famous memes, which weren't created by political parties, for example, was a AI-generated version of Nigel Farage running into, I think it was Boris Johnson's, Rishi Sunak's and Keir Starmer's Minecraft house and blowing them up, right? There's no policy in there. You can't, it's, you know, but they were able to tap into that a bit and start going, okay, let's see if we can use like a let's play language to express our memes using this kind of format, right? Because that's what became popular. So it's about the art of that. It's about tapping into these areas of culture, what's the zeitgeist, and matching it back up. Some policies and parties don't get mentioned in general elections because they're not sexy enough to be talking about. Although I will have to say, you know, one of the things the Conservatives did not do very well is the National Service Plan. So in the last general election, they came into it being like, okay, we're going to restart national service where young people have to either go to the army or something like that. Basically restart kind of the old style conscription that happened in the 1950s. And they thought, do you know what? TikTok's the place we're going to post this. And like, that's not what you should be doing, because you should be looking at the platform going, you know what, this isn't going to be very popular for young people. But they posted it there anyway, thinking, again, this is before really they clocked on how to use the platform. And it became a bit of a joke, and it backfired massively. So it's about having people within your campaigns realizing what you should be saying on certain platforms and what you shouldn't be saying as well.
But then, like you said, like do you think there is a danger of politics because meme sort of tends to oversimplify policies? Yeah. And also you cannot give a lot of information in terms of policy. Like you cannot just upload a document on TikTok and expect people to read. Yeah,
you can't talk about, you know, complex financial policy in a 15-second video, for example. You know, that's not going to work. But you know, you might, if you're an effective communicator, you can maybe allude to what you're doing and why you're doing it. Mm-hmm. Maybe that could work, but again, it's still going to be very emotive if you want it to be very popular. You know, we know how the algorithm works. This is another big issue with platforms, in fact, is the sense that isn't just the short form content side of it, it's in what platforms will show you, right? So if you have a certain music track, if you're certainly emotive, if you get lots of engagement because you create a highly engaging post because you're very angry, then that short snippet of policy is going to get out further than if someone was to try to talk about policy in a more coherent way. So we can argue that the algorithms are forcing parties to try and summarize content to make it, again, more emotive. And that's problematic in the sense that it could lead to more what's called effective polarization. And this is where effective polarization is this concept where people, they don't just dislike the other party because their policies, they viscerally hate other people, right? So if you were to look at America at the moment, and you see this massive division amongst even families because maybe someone voted for Trump and someone didn't, that family could be split up quite easily, and that's how we see effective polarization. The way the algorithms in these platforms operate, it is pushing that kind of effective polarization because it's forcing people to be more emotive, and this more emotive leads to that kind of anger, which can lead to divided families and things like that. So it isn't just necessarily the shortness of the content, it's what you have to post to get through the algorithm, to get on the front page, get onto the For You page. That could be probably be more damaging than the shortness of the content. And this is something, academia is starting to look into more.
Do you also think the damage is more long-term than...
I think it's, once you feel an emotive feeling towards someone, if you hate Donald Trump, you're not going to magically like Donald Trump because he's changed his policies. You're going to hate him as a person. And if that's where our politics is going, that necessarily isn't conducive to nice democratic debate where you can come to a compromise. If you're fueling a type of political narrative where your side is the best, the other side is evil, you're not going to later on halfway, 30 minutes down the road, or even a couple of weeks down the road, look at that person who you've labelled as the enemy and say, yeah, let's come to a nice kind of compromise agreement or something like that. That's very difficult to do. So when such high levels of emotion are running high, not necessarily the best thing for democracy.
Interesting, because from what I'm observing, because I come from India, and in 2014 the use of Facebook in politics sort of began, using posts on Facebook, creating those I support this party, that party for profile picture, those sort of small but effective things sort of started running on Facebook, and it did give a massive support to the winning party in that election. And from there on, the kind of involvement which I had seen in India, and especially during elections, has been more of what we've talked now, has been more, is going more and more towards polarizing the citizens of either this or that.
It is kind of, you could argue it is definitely going. I mean, there are probably other factors behind there as well. You can't just look at platforms and be like, they're the reason why this is happening. There's underlying politics going on behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. If you look at, for example, the Brexit vote over here as well, that was a highly polarizing moment in British politics. The underlying ideologies and the underlying policies that led to that, that's not because of social media, right? There's issues to do with potentially, I'm not saying everyone who voted for Brexit is a racist, for example, right? But there is a lot of anti-immigrant discussions that have been going in the United Kingdom since, Enoch Powell, right? There's been that bubbling underneath the surface, and that's the platforms aren't around for that, right? So there's other things going on behind the scenes when it comes to this increased polarization in society, and there are people who are studying that in a very extensive way. But you can look at what platforms are doing. That's not to say platforms like Facebook, X, I'll probably say less of X now, but and Instagram and platforms like this can't be good for democracy, right? It's very easy to become a doomer, about these things. But if we do want them to be very, very good for democracy going forward, to allow this type of public debate, we have to design for it, right? You can't just go out to platforms who are incentivized by economics, the biggest hire, the highest user figures, the most advertisers on there. Because that's when you look at platforms, that's what they're there. They're commercial entities. They're not democratic entities. They may come around and be like, okay, well, we should probably do something in this instance because otherwise we're going to be regulated. They're not doing it often out the kindness of their own hearts. They're doing it because, or sometimes it's because it's their USP, right? So when Twitter was more Twitter rather than X, one of their USPs, their selling points, was it's the public agora. It's where you find journalists, politicians, campaigners, activists, and so forth. So they thought, okay, we should probably facilitate this a bit more. And before Elon Musk took over, they were very engaging with academics, right? They were giving us data to analyze and give them reports back and things like this. So, but again, it's still a commercial decision for them. So the thing we have to think about is, okay, if we want these platforms to be good for democracy, if we want them to stop things such as, families ripping apart, or just people just being angry all the day, we have to look at, okay, should we be implementing regulation and what that would look like if we were to do that? Because regulation is always a very touchy subject because it starts overlapping potentially people's freedom of speech. But if we do, we should be designing for it, and we should be encouraging platforms through various mechanisms to facilitate that.
Interesting. And because there's still a huge difference on memes used for sort of formal campaigns, just like you mentioned that some political parties post memes on their pages and not through dummy pages or people who support them make memes for them. And then there's also memes which sort of like they're meme pages, they make memes about everything. So like what do you find more impactful for audience or people in general?
It depends what you mean with the word impactful, right? It depends on where you're coming from. If you're talking about, who's the most effective at using memes, you'd always have to look at kind of, okay, well, ultimately, political parties, they already have a stage, they already had a followership, they already have links with journalists, what they post will be analysed by the other news media as well. So their use of it is effective in the sense that it will go out there, it will be spread. And sometimes you can create the world's funniest meme as an everyday citizen, but because you don't have a following, you don't have a meme page, for example, well, no one's going to see it or hear it, right? So it isn't just the sense of who can create the best memes or the most effective memes. It's about who also can use what channels they have in the most effective way, if that makes sense, right? So the idea of political parties using them, I'd say they're okay at it. Sometimes they come off incredibly cringy. Because they're obviously using them wrong. Again, there's some cracking ones from last UK general election where they were just posting stuff on TikTok and you're like, no. At least they didn't do Skibbity Toilet, right? That's all I'm happy about. I was going to be, if I saw that, I think I would have quit academia or just changed my research subject. I'd be like, right, that's it, we're over. It's too much of a joke now. If you were talking about like satellite campaigns, we saw a lot of satellite campaigns or organisations which aren't political parties but will support them in some way. So, for example, meme pages which are dedicated just to sharing memes for a particular political party. They're fairly effective, but again, who's their audience? It's typically just politics nerds. The meme pages you spoke about are probably one of the most interesting things to look at because their audience is really apolitical often. People just join them because they want to go on Instagram and have a few laughs for a bit and then scroll off to do something else, right? And that's how I use them sometimes. I'm sure that's how you use it, some of your audience as well. They're interesting in the sense that they will accidentally have an audience who they could potentially apolitical, highly influential. They're not an audience who are predisposed to vote in a certain way. They could have some influence. Again, it depends on how big their pages are. So there's something to look for and see, okay, are they going to wield their power forward to trying to get people to vote a certain way? Typically they don't. And the ones we saw in the 2017 general election, they just picked up the funniest memes and they were just sharing them regardless, right? They just thought, what is the funniest thing we can post? And in 2017, it was literally just taking the mickey out of Theresa May for being a bit robotic. And what we saw in 2019, again, the Conservatives were trying to tap into that a bit. Marginally successful, I would argue, because people were sharing, these meme pages were sharing kind of Conservative content. But I think in this general election, I think people who run these pages have been a bit more critical now. They know what parties are trying to do. They're trying to kind of get their content on these pages. So I think it's, again, it depends on each individual page because it's kind of nebulous, right? There's no one meme page for everything. There's thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of different meme pages across the different platforms. So it's hard to generalize in that way. But yeah, it was something interesting to look for is how they react.
How do you see the difference between the memes now when we talk about on social media versus when the actual word meme was coined in biology?
That is a good question. So I don't prescribe to the Richard Dawkins. So he was the person who created the word meme. I don't think internet memes fit what he was talking about, right? He was viewing memes as kind of this virus-type organism that spread from brain to brain, from idea to idea, from person to person, sorry. The internet meme is often nonsensical, right? I remember when I was like a teenager, there was the insane wolf meme, you know, very simple, just an image, some text on top of it. Anyone can change them round. Memes have kind of adapted. They've become a bit more esoteric as well, in the sense that people are joining into there's memes which still prevail. Have you ever heard of the lost meme?
No.
I'm saying this because people who know the lost meme will be very angry I've just mentioned it. It's a meme that is literally, it's an old web comic that someone turned into a bit of a joke because it was like a comedic web comic and it got into a really serious subject and just like, what the hell are you doing? And it became a meme. That's still shared around. So you still have that old style of memes, but it's moving into more audio-visual forms now. You have more video memes and they're a bit more difficult to create. You can't just launch a website and create a meme like that anymore. But yeah, I think that's kind of how it's changing, it's evolving. I mean, it's also, we're getting newer, younger generations in and they have a different comedic style. Again, with memes, when I came around, it was very much millennial, random humor, like LOL, Ruffle, that kind of stuff, right? If you talk to a young Generation Z or even a Generation Alpha, they'll be like, what's that, Grandpa? They look at you and be like, what are you talking about? This is the language of your elders. Now they've got their own style of comedy, so it's probably to look to what they're doing now. There's a lot of brain rot. There's a lot of, again, it's more random, but I think as that style develops, it'd be interesting to see where it goes next.
Yeah, because now I think memes have also sort of turned into sources of gossips and talks.
How do you mean?
Because a lot of information are also shared in the form of memes.
Yeah.
Like, for example, if some event happened, for example, the Oscar, when the Will Smith slap thing.
Yeah.
A lot of people outside those who don't follow Oscar regularly, they got to know about this incident through memes, and memes got created of.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I think memes have always been a bit like that. I think there's always, for a meme to be successful and shareable, it has to have some sort of relatability to you, right? So even if you don't know what the insane wolf is, and it talked about, and it's been recontextualized to be about the Oscars, stand on the stage, slap the post, that would be a very good insane wolf meme. You would look at that and be like, okay, that's quite funny because you'd kind of understand what the news is. So you still have to be tying in something that people know about, because otherwise, if you saw a meme you didn't understand, or it didn't have some underlying context which you got, it would just be meaningless to you, right? So an error meme, it still has to be tying something, an underlying knowledge that you're aware of. And sometimes, yeah, you will learn through memes. I think there are dedicated memes news channels now.
Yeah.
Not TV channels, but, social media accounts that will share the news through memes.
They're faster than TV channels.
I mean, that's not always a good thing, though, right? The reason why TV channels are so slow is because they have to verify the information, right, otherwise they get sued. If they could be, libel or slander, for example, So that's something probably news channels are a bit more cautious about. But yeah, you do get memes that share information like that. But again, how much information is through that, that's something we need to be cautious of.
Yeah. And what's the future of online politics?
I would never want to ask or be an academic who tries to predict the future. I think there are many famous instances where an academic's made a online bet. I think I'm not going to mention names, but on TV as a made a bet, he had to eat his own book on camera, right? So asking an academic to predict the future is going to be a hard one. I think the thing we have to worry about at the moment with online social discourse is possibly what's happening in America at the moment, in the sense that platforms have been politically forced to have this more free speech agenda. And that's worrying in the sense that they've taken away content moderation, which has allowed people with lots of hateful views to be promoted, right? So I think that's an area to look for. I think I'm quite pessimistic about the future of social media in that regard. And there's also things about kind of creating decentralized networks. People have been talking about creating a decentralized social media platform for 10 years. It's never really taken off. Blue Sky's a little bit, but still it's quite a centralized platform. So yeah, I wouldn't want to predict the future. I have a very hopeful view of what it could look like. If we were to think very critically, start thinking about how we design these platforms for democracy, to promote democratic values and to allow for people to come together and have this discourse. But I don't think that's going to be something we're going to see very soon. Mm-hmm. It's not commercially viable.
When you said you don't want to predict the future, but then do you recognize a pattern on how things can go, at least in coming 5 or 10 years, in terms of if this pattern continues, then we might see maybe political parties using a certain strategies, or maybe we could see more polarization or less polarization in that context of how do we see politics online?
That's really a good way of phrasing it. I wouldn't want to predict 10 years in the future, because we look 10 years in the past and we go, what are social media platforms like then? And we'd be like, no one could have predicted, the rise of TikTok, for example. I think the one thing to look at, though, is that a lot of platforms have stagnated, in the sense there's not really much to add to the value product with the current technologies we have. And probably one of the reasons why Meta was so focused for a short period on this metaverse idea was they're probably scrambling for the next big killer app idea. So it would be interesting to look at if some new amazing technology comes out. They tried VR a couple of times, right? I really hope we don't get VR memes, because that would be a horror show. Could you imagine with a pair of goggles watching memes all day long? I don't think that's a future I would like to see. In terms of polarization, I think you'd also have to look at the current political climate. And if you're looking at specifically the United Kingdom, we have had the rise of reform, right? And part of their growth is through social media, through this grassroots. There have been, I will have to say, some academic evidence that some of their grassroots activity is paid for bot content. We have seen evidence of that in the last general election, so it's probably something to be careful of. So it's important to look at kind of what we have at the moment, and it does seem like polarization, depending on where the politics goes, though. Right. So, for example, one of the big issues in UK politics at the moment is small boats immigration. Right. This is the idea of people crossing the English Channel from France to England on tiny boats to come here as illegal immigrants. And that's a big political issue. Now, if, for example, the United Kingdom government fixes that issue, whatever that fix looks like, I don't like using the word fix for this particular issue, but you understand what I'm trying to talk about. then maybe what has been fueling that polarization might die down a bit, and maybe that will be reflected on social media content. But if I was Reform and I was realizing that the growth of my party is through these very controversial topics, I would have something that's going to be the next big issue, what's the big next woke thing to attack, right? And then that's going to be the next division, and how they use the platforms can create this division. Without stifling political debate, that's something that's very hard to regulate. So again, I don't think it's necessarily going to be a platform. It's not going to be because social media exists. I mean, it's partly through social media this kind of not very good political communication goes through. This kind of horrible narratives that we see, these online debates which turn nasty very quickly, the online abuse we see. Yes, for example, I'll talk about abuse a bit because that is a big issue on social media and politics at the moment, and it does fuel polarization. Yes, platforms do try and stop abuse, and because it is happening on their platforms, but you still have people at the other side of the screen who decide to wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to go online today and abuse a politician, and I'm going to send death threats or something like that, right? Maybe they don't wake up and thinking that. I hope no one wakes up in the morning and that's their first thought. Maybe they see something, they're reacting to it. That's what you tend to see. So it depends on what we as a society, I think, if we're going to look into the future, look at the evidence base, we look at is there any kind of hunger to look at platforms and regulate them in some way? We had in the United Kingdom the Online Safety Act recently, which was a very watered down bill. It was more far encompassing than it currently is. It's mostly focused on children, but the initial green and white papers were far more expansive. And it just seems like there's no appetite for that. So I think that's the one thing to look at, like, what's the political appetite for these types of regulation? So I think what we currently have for the next 5 years is probably going to be sticking around for a bit. I think if TikTok continues the way it's going to be and as its main platforms, then we're going to have a very interesting future political debate. It's going to be very short. I mean, that's a positive thing. Maybe if you're not interested in reading news, you might be getting lots of shorts. But we'll have to. Yeah, I'm not going to be trying to predict the future. I think I'll focus on what things we can look at. Again, looking at how people are using platforms. And I'll look at these issues and think, okay, this is where it might go in the future. But as we've seen from each general election to each general election, there's always something different, something always unexpected, some new meme, some new form of content. We didn't expect political parties to be on TikTok, and then they did, right? So that's why I don't want to predict, because the research project I was based off was going to be looking at Instagram Reels, because none of the political parties were on TikTok. And then we sat there 2 days after the general election was called, like, we're going to have to change our entire research project now. So I wouldn't want to predict like that.
Interesting, because from what I understand is like almost any new platform that comes and gets accepted by people at large will see political parties having their page.
Yeah, there's a really interesting there's a pattern behind what politicians and then parties and how they adopt them. I think even if you look at how politicians started using web pages, right? I think that's where you should start, because there's lots of research on what certain politicians used it and why they use these new platforms. And then you look at them and TikTok, like, it's the same thing again, right? It's very cyclical. So you'll have this initial burst of kind of activity about the platform. You'll have these kind of nerds using it, maybe. That's how the internet kind of started out, right? There's lots of nerds, and then you got the nerdy MPs. Maybe they would sign up. So with TikTok, it wasn't necessarily the nerdy ones. It was the MPs that had a greater touch with kind of current day culture, right? So you have that. Then you see other MPs looking at them being like, oh, they're using this platform. This sounds interesting. And then they'll evaluate the utility of it for them. You're like, okay, well, maybe it's got a big audience. Maybe it's an audience I want to speak to. So maybe they will sign up to it that way. So you have the same trends, and then you'll And then finally it'll become this point where it's seen as unacceptable not to be in a platform, right? You'll have, for example, if an MP didn't have a web page, you would be looking like, why do you not have a web page? Do you not want to represent your citizens? Do you not want to talk to them? It's the same as not wanting to talk to the media, right? So there is a certain stages of development we see. There are all these platforms that go through. If we were to look into the future, though, right, it's very hard for a new platform to come to fruition, right, to become this new mainstay platform. It's actually because you've got the audience, right? That's the important thing. If you look at platforms, their biggest selling thing is how many people are currently using it. And there's been so many brand new platforms that have come around. They're trying to, they've got this brand new USP. I remember there was one called Vero a while ago. And it just flops because people don't sign up to it. They have their audiences elsewhere. Which is why I don't want to predict the future as well, right? Because you don't know which platforms are going to make it. I mean, Blue Sky, for example, that came around at a very opportune moment when one platform was literally tanking itself of users, and people were just looking for somewhere which was similar. It's very unlikely another platform is going to try and go that way because it's economic suicide, right? What Elon Musk did to Twitter, it's not good for his bank balance, I would argue, but he probably doesn't really care about that anyway. He's too busy listening to Grimes at 4 a.m, streaming and playing video games to worry about things such as how much money he's got. So it's a very unvolatile market, right? It's not got that same excitement as when social media first came about. You could create your own platform. It's this new hip cool thing. Yes, TikTok is that, but now it's becoming uncool in its own way, right? In some instances, it seems a bit cringe to even be using the platform if you're an older person, right? It's the same as if you had an MP trying to use Snapchat. You'd be like, mate, it's a bit weird, right? So it depends on the MP as well. Their personal profile. There may be a time when TikTok wants to expand its audience past young people and try to get more older people on there. That could be dangerous because then that's what happened to Facebook, right? Facebook used to be this cool, hip, new platform. I remember it in 2010. That's where the 2010 student protest started off down in London. It wouldn't happen like that on Facebook anymore because it's just not the place you would do that. So yeah, I think it's looking at kind of all these factors together. If a new platform was to come around, be like, okay, what's the success of it? What's the utility for MPs? And the sad fact is as well that most MPs, they don't have the time to communicate one-on-one with citizens, right? If we look at kind of the basic what's good for democracy, we live in a representative democracy. The idea is that you stand for other people, and through discussion with people that you represent, you should be facilitating their wishes at this higher scale. MPs don't have time to talk to 80,000 constituents on social media, verify that they're real, weed out all the trolls, all the people who are just there to abuse them, for example. They are using these platforms very much top down, which is why some platforms, you don't have a WhatsApp for most MPs, right? Because I don't think I would want to be in an MP's WhatsApp because they would just be abused, right? That's just because how sometimes people are on the internet. So yeah, it's not an easy thing to try and predict in the next few years. I think we're going to see more of the same. We're probably going to see more MPs becoming a lot better with using short form video, using memes, because there's utility in that for them, right? Because they know there's an audience for that type of content now, so they're going to start doing it. In the same way, lots of MPs thought, there's no point going on Twitter because no one's there. Now there was an audience there was journalists there, then they start using it. So yeah, it's looking at not just what these new platforms, if there's going to be a new platform. I'm not sure if you're creating one. What if would it be called the Thakkarverse or something? I would join your social media platform, your new social media app if you had one. They would look at it and be like, okay, well, what's the audience for it? For example, what's the things I can do in it? Can I broadcast to lots of people and see where it goes from there?
Yeah, Ben, I also think because when digitization sort of began, when, like you said, to start off with the web pages and now having posts and now having pages on social media. I think before that, if we go, the only platform where the access of MPs and political parties were on sort of a neutral stage. Like when they go on to news channel debates, the news channel would not be owned by them.
Yeah.
They would have a counterpart to talk and debate.
Yeah.
But now when they have their web pages, their pages on social media, I think it's more of like they're growing their echo chamber where people sort of only support them, or they people who kind of think same, visualize same and support the same thing or same party, and sort of creating a bigger bubble of the same party or same ideology.
Yeah, so it's a good way to... there's platform effects probably going on in some of these areas. Some of them probably allow for more of that to happen. There's a... there's a book I have in mind.
Because algorithm works that way. Like if I only support one party, I engage with reels or TikToks that support one party or are in that domain, I'm less exposed to the counterparts.
Yeah, I mean, part of that, especially in platforms like YouTube, for example, their algorithm, if you watch something which is right-wing content, for example, their algorithm will go, this person likes some right-wing content, let's show them more of that. Right, so there's the algorithm behind the system as well. But if we look quite systematically, the wider picture, if we were to look at social media as a whole, there's academic work by Christian Vicari and his co-author, who I can't remember, and I'm really sorry I can't remember that. I will put it in the comments of your video when I remember it. That looks at it on a whole scale, and they go, okay, does social media cause this does it cause filter bubbles? And they actually look at it and they go, not quite in the same way. Part of their argument is the fact that people who are in a filter bubble, they place themselves there. So if they like a political party, they're still only going to watch a certain type of content. In the same way that people who voted Labour, for example, in the 1950s would have read the Daily Mirror, right? They would have been selective about their choice of media based off their political values. That's still something we see on social media. That's not necessarily a new thing. What they argue is that some social media platforms on the whole, it does actually give you access to the opposite side at a greater and sometimes to a greater extent we've ever seen. Television has always been more equal because there's regulation in the UK to try and make that to happen. There's supposed to be an unbias within the system there. And again, that shows you that regulation can work. If television can be regulated to make these debates more equal, social media possibly can be as well. Which is why this regulation is a big factor in this, right? That's ultimately what's going to curtail and shape how platforms operate in the future. It just depends if there's appetite to make it happen.
Interesting. Yeah. So how do you like this podcast? Do you have any questions for me at the end?
Yeah, I love the podcast. I think it's great. I think it's important that academics don't just do this research and then they just publish it and they throw it over a wall, right? Very often there's this very ivory towerness where we do this really good piece of research and we spend our lives on a very small subject of areas. And then we don't talk to people about it. So I think podcasts like this are really important for that reason, in the sense that, if you have an audience of people who would never engage with academic work, if they're not in the academic filter bubble, to get that research out there and to let people know it exists, that there is people looking at these very deep concepts and these different ideas. And if you just have a look at their work occasionally, it might surprise you. So it's a nice. Maybe you can turn this into a meme, and maybe you can filter your podcast into a shorter form of content even further. I'm not sure how you turn this conversation into a meme, but I'll leave that in your capable hands.
I'm still incapable, but I'll find someone who can.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure being on the show.
Thank you. Any questions for me?
Not off the top of my head.
No.
Other than, has it been helpful? has been useful.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, it has been.
I think the question I would have is, to what degree, so a lot of your background is Indian politics. When you look at the UK politics, do you think, I'm glad I'm from India, we don't have this craziness over here? Or do you think there's lots of commonalities in some ways? Do you think there's lots of things which are the same? And which ways do you think the social media environment's different over there when it comes to politics?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have background such in politics, but I mean, yeah, because I was the Prime Minister is Narendra Modi, and when I was born, he was Chief Minister of the state I was born in.
Okay.
So almost like for the entire life I have been under his leadership. So yeah. So and that sort of made an expectation of how would I expect him to sort of work in national politics.
Okay.
And made me sort of more interested in understanding how people as such behave and talk. And because even in India, a lot of youths are interested in listening and knowing and talking about politics. And the number is surprisingly huge.
Good.
In terms of how many youth engage. So that was a sort of surprise for me here, that not a lot of people are as interested to talk about politics.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I mean, if you go to... I think when I've looked at stuff about youth politics in the past, I think it's always interesting that young people always do have a political opinion, right? Even if they don't advertise it often, people often treat silence as apathy sometimes, or just disinterest. And that's not really the case. If you speak to young people about a particular issue, they're passionate. But I think there's also like a scaredness of posting things on the internet now. I think one of the big differences for younger generations is an awareness that things stay on the internet now. You know,
I've actually felt that when I came to UK.
Oh, really? Like,
yeah, I sort of felt that I should not post this.
Yeah.
Just in case. And that I didn't felt when I was in India.
Yeah, and that could be down to better information literacy, right? Because, I lived with someone who went on to become an MP, and his previous, he was writing blogs when he was a student, and it came back up, and it was a national scandal because he said something he definitely shouldn't have said, right? So it's good that young people, I guess, are aware of that, but it's also sad if it's stopping them from participating. So that's a bit of a double-edged sword, this awareness of what can happen to your content in the future versus your opinions and values not being heard. I think it's one of the big dichotomies to look at when it comes to youth politics, is that scaredness to participate. And if there's a way of facilitating it in a way which is helpful for young people to not disadvantage their futures, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, it's a good thing that we've got lots of young people from your country like being active. I mean, that's probably what it needs, right? I mean, a healthy democracy does need people speaking up, having their values heard. Yeah. So maybe it's a good model to look at.
Yeah, and also it is on the largest democracy of the world.
Yeah, definitely. So it needs lots of even more people speaking, right? It must be an interesting place to study politics. Just from my internet politics as well must be huge.
Yeah.
How do you even,
it will be interesting for any academic to study.
I'm sure there's people working on it.
Yeah.
I know one or two who are. Someone who did my PhD was looking at Indian politics.
Interesting.
And she was just like, you have it so easy over here. They're just like, there's so much less data for you to go through. I was just like, thanks. Is that a good thing? I don't know. It is. It's fascinating. It's a fascinating world.
Thank you so much for doing this.
No problem.
It was lovely talking to you.
It's lovely speaking to you as well. Cheers.
Thank you.